He had a really good salary. He got caught up in this mistake, and he promised the military that if he were to leave, he would never return again to Liberation Square and not participate in this. And all of us actually, when we were released, were asked to sign papers saying that we would not return to Liberation Square unless we got some type of permission from the military. They were helpful enough to tell us how we can get that permission, but they made it very clear that we couldn't just simply return to Liberation Square without letting them know in advance that we were going to be coming or having some kind of proper authentication or verification to let us in.
Certainly, Ayman, we're really glad to see you out of there and to see that you were not harmed. But of course, our thoughts are with all the people who are still there. Do tell us, because we've heard of the pressure in which journalists have been in the last 2 weeks. We've heard of French journalists being beaten as well and arrested as well. Some of them even have left Egypt. Give us a sense of the pressure, in which these journalists have to work every day. And do you get a sense that it's easing at all after the widespread international reaction?
Well, what's emerged really now is two different realities for journalists here. When you're out in the streets and you carry with you some identification that you are a foreign journalist and that perhaps you're just walking through the streets trying to do this story or tell the story about the people, you're subject to the kind of chaos or lawlessness that existed on the streets for some days after these protests began. And so many journalists took these cautions of hiding their press identifications, hiding sometimes their foreign identification, so that if they are stopped or if they were stopped, they wouldn't be harassed and they wouldn't be intimidated, because as we've seen, sometimes, particularly last week during the pro-Mubarak protests, there was a very aggressive campaign to try to, reach foreign journalists and tell them, show Egypt, show the pro-Mubarak supporters and all this, which many journalists, wanted to show originally, but were just simply hampered from doing so. That is one reality. And so many journalists have been a little bit cautious to go out and take that extra measure by concealing their identity when they're dealing with the people. When you're dealing with the government says, well, no, we're allowing foreign journalists to work and they are allowed to operate. And so they then show the journalists their identification and they're dealt with the pressures of the government restricting their access. And as we were reporting, there was a Reuters cameraman, some of the names that you mentioned as well. So there now are really two different realities emerging for journalists, and that's what is making it so difficult. Personal safety and just the challenges of dealing with the government against this backdrop of trying to tell the story for the people here.
Well, certainly we appreciate your work. Ayman Mohildeen in Cairo. Thank you, Ayman, for sharing your experience there with us. Thank you very much. Now on to other news, and Sudan's President Omar al-Bashir has formally accepted that the South will break away with the results of a referendum due in the coming hours. Preliminary results showed nearly 99% voted in favor of secession. The poll was part of a 2005 North-South peace deal, which ended decades of civil war. Let's go to South Sudan's capital, Juba now. Haru Mutasa is reporting there for us. Haru, what's going to be happening in the next few hours when they announce this result in Juba?
Well, people here are already excited, and on the mobile phone networks, messages are being sent. Let me just read one out to you. It says, for example, congratulations, we are now a nation. Prepare for the challenges of nation building with unity, justice and patience. People have waited a long time to hear the confirmation that there will be an independent nation. Now, unfortunately, here in the South, the original plan, because people thought the announcement would be at 11 a.m. local time, has been moved to 7 p.m. local time. And the square where people were told to gather will be dark, and officials are concerned about security issues. So people have been asked to celebrate at home or in bars, but no doubt wherever they celebrate, we're expecting to see people finally happy and celebrating the fact that they are now going to become an independent nation. Folly?
But of course, a lot of challenges, as we've been saying, Haru, remain, and the main one being security, of course.
Yes, one of them is security. There were recent clashes between soldiers from the Sudan Armed Forces. There are clashes on and off between the Lord's Resistance Army, the rebel group from Uganda, and then from defectors from the Sudan People's Liberation Army. So whenever they attack villages or cause insecurity in certain parts of the region, it is a cause for concern. There are other issues, of course. There's still unfinished business between the North and the South, outstanding issues such as border demarcation, oil sharing, citizenship, the contested region of IBA, for example. So officials have to also sort those things out. And then just the humanitarian task of building a nation that's literally starting from scratch, huge amounts of poverty, high illiteracy rates, building schools, hospitals, just basic services to get this country up and running. Officials will need to rely on the international community, rely on the donor community. They are confident they can achieve what they set out to achieve. They are all aware, they say, that it's a huge task, a mammoth challenge, but they're saying given the help they need, they're confident that they can build South Sudan and one day it could become a successful nation.
Thank you very much, Harun Mutasa, reporting there live from Juba in southern Sudan. The founder of WikiLeaks has returned to court in the UK in his latest attempt to fight extradition to Sweden over claims of sexual misconduct. Let's get the details from Barbara Serra in our European Broadcast Centre in London. Barbara.
Polly, thank you. Yes, Julian Assange is wanted for questioning by Swedish authorities over claims that he committed sexual offences against 2 women in Stockholm last year. But his defence says he shouldn't be extradited because he hasn't actually been charged with a crime. Well, his defence team plans to argue that the Swedish prosecutor simply doesn't have the right to issue an EAW, that's a European arrest warrant. They're concerned the trial will be held in secret with no chance of open justice. They also call it an abuse of proceedings because Assange has repeatedly offered himself up for questioning, but he's been turned down. Now, they argue Assange is a victim of illegal and corrupt behavior by Swedish prosecutors and that any extradition could lead to his deportation to the United States, where he could face the death penalty. Well, let's cross straight now to Al Jazeera's Lawrence Lee. He's been listening to the proceedings in court. He joins us live now from outside Belmarsh Magistrates Court in southeast London. OK, Lawrence, tell us a little bit more now about that case by the defence that you heard in court.
Well, as you say, they're trying to do several things at the same time to undermine the case for extradition, quite apart from the suggestion that Assange may not receive a fair trial in Sweden. They're trying to attack the allegations made by these 2 women, the 2 alleged rape victims, by trying to suggest that far from being rape, in fact, the sex was entirely consensual. Therefore, they say there's no case to answer and that the case isn't fit for extradition in the first place because some of what happened, they say, wouldn't even be a crime in Britain, and so therefore he shouldn't be extradited. But apart from that, the other thing they're trying to do is to undermine the reputation of the prosecutor who has issued this European arrest warrant against Assange. This morning, the defence barrister tried to suggest that she didn't have the right or the power to exercise that warrant, and therefore the warrant basically shouldn't be allowed to stand. And to try to undermine her further, they've introduced their first witness this afternoon, a female, a former judge, a Swedish judge, who told the hearing here that she felt that the case against Assange brought by this prosecutor was peculiar and malicious, and that the Swedish prosecutor was biased against innocent men. So there's a sort of personal attack now against the Swedish prosecutor as well. But one of the problems that we've seen with this is that when that witness was then cross-examined by the prosecution here, she turned out to be half deaf and couldn't hear the questions properly, nor could she explain points of Swedish law very clearly in English. And so one of the problems with this is you have a British court trying to understand some of the intricacies of Swedish law from a distance to make really quite important decisions based on it. And it's not really working very well at the moment.
It does sound pretty complicated. OK, so we're hearing that the defence is trying to undermine the prosecution. So what's the prosecution saying?
Well, in simple terms, they opened this morning by saying, first of all, that they believe that Assange did use violence against these women when he had sex with them. And they also tried to undermine the defence claim that the only reason why they want him extradited to Sweden is in order to make it easier then for the United States to extradite him to America to face much more important and harsher charges to do with WikiLeaks and spying. And so the prosecution say that's not the case, that wouldn't happen. But what they haven't done yet, the prosecution, is answer the key question: why is it that the prosecutor in Sweden was prepared to interview these 2 alleged victims, the rape victims, by telephone, but not speak to Assange by telephone? Indeed, the defence said that he offered to go into the Swedish embassy in London or the police station in the middle of London to speak to the prosecutor via video link, and they said, no, that's no good, you've got to come to Sweden. And so that's why some of Assange's friends here think there are these sort of dark forces from the CIA or somewhere at work behind the scenes trying to spirit him away on these trumped-up charges in order to eventually get him to the United States.
Certainly a lot at play here. Lawrence Lee with the latest there from Belmarsh Magistrates Court in southeast London. Thank you for that. A new report from the UK has shown that Britain's previous government did all it could to help Libya win the release of the man convicted of the Pan Am Lockerbie bombing back in 1998. That's despite the London government insisting the decision was made entirely by officials in Scotland. Paul Brennan has the story.
The release of the Lockerbie bomber Abdel Basit Ali Mohammed al-Magrahi in 2009 caused considerable anger in America and the UK. And the news that behind the scenes the then UK government was doing all it could to secure his freedom will further stir